This is a special edition of the Officer Down Memorial Podcast.
Hi, everyone. Scott Rose here with the Officer Down Memorial Podcast. Hey, if you're a cop or you're relatively new to the podcast or you haven't even tried it yet, this is a great episode for you to check out and learn more about the project. Retired Hennepin County Sheriff's Office Captain David Zimmer is a police fellow with the Center of the American Experiment, where he writes about criminal justice and public safety. He's also a huge advocate for cops in Minnesota, pushing for public safety policy that will ensure a consequential criminal justice system for Minnesotans. David's a 33-year law enforcement veteran, and he's always been a great supporter of the podcast. He asked me to come to his show and to talk about the podcast, talk about how it got started, about our mission, why it's so important for us to remember and honor our fallen heroes, and more. We also talk about the next story that's coming up, the Joe Bergeron story from Maplewood, Minnesota. The Center of the American Experiment. If you haven't heard of them, if you haven't checked them out, it's a great civic, educational 501c3 organization that advocates for effective and responsible public policy here in Minnesota. And just as important, it calls out those policies that aren't responsible. You can hear and read more about David's work and check out this great organization online on their website at americanexperiment.org. I'll share their link in the show notes, along with a link to the video of the interview so you can watch it if you'd like to. Remember, forewarning, I do have the perfect face for radio if you remember my story. So, as always, we also want to take a minute to thank Law Enforcement Labor Services for their support of this podcast and the project. They've been a huge supporter and a huge partner with us in Minnesota. So, coming up, my interview with David Zimmer on the American Experiment Podcast. Law Enforcement Labor Services, also known as LELS, is Minnesota's largest public safety labor union, with over 7,000 Minnesota public safety members serving in all areas of public safety: law enforcement, 911 dispatch centers, corrections, public safety administrative support personnel, and firefighters. Established in 1977, LELS serves over 260 different public safety agencies and over 450 locals across the state of Minnesota. With their administration, general counsel, 3 staff attorneys, and 14 business agents, LELS provides contract negotiations for better wages and benefits, grievance processing and representation, discipline representation, mediation and arbitration, assistance with representation for post-board hearings, and in-line of duty death benefits for survivor families. Find out more about Law Enforcement Labor Services at LELS.org. LELS.org.
Hello. Each year in May, our nation pays tribute to our law enforcement community by recognizing and honoring the sacrifices of those officers who have been killed in the line of duty. It's a tradition that began by presidential proclamation in 1962, when President Kennedy declared May 15th as National Peace Officers Memorial Day, and the week in which May 15th falls as National Police Week. In recognition of National Police Week in 2025, we thought it would be informative to speak with Minnesota's own Dodge County Sheriff Scott Rose, who has created a wonderful podcast of his own entitled the Officer Down Memorial Podcast. Welcome to our podcast, Sheriff Rose.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me. I appreciate it.
You bet. With National Police Week underway and the National Peace Officers Memorial Day coming up Thursday, I thought it would be timely to have you on and learn more about the effort you've undertaken to pay tribute to our fallen officers here in Minnesota. But before we learn about your podcast, let's learn more about you personally and professionally. You're the Dodge County Sheriff in Minnesota here, and I have to say, if I'm correct, Mantorville is your county seat?
County seat. Absolutely.
And I think many of our viewers have probably experienced the wonderful Hubble House.
The Hubble House. So good.
Yeah. Are you a frequenter of the Hubble House?
Honestly, I live like a block and a half from there. So Rosie and I will walk there and either go into the saloon for a quick meal or we go into the regular restaurant for something more formal, but it's a beautiful restaurant, and we love it.
That is a Minnesota treat.
Absolutely.
Tell us about your professional career and when did you get started in law enforcement and so on?
Absolutely. So law enforcement for me is a second career. I actually was in radio before law enforcement, and worked in radio until I was in my early 30s. Ended up going back into law enforcement. I'm the third of four generations of cops in my family. My dad worked for the Dodge County Sheriff's Office. My grandfather was a special deputy in Divide County, North Dakota. And my oldest son, this year, it's his 13th or 14th year with Colorado State Patrol.
Oh, great.
So lots of law enforcement in my family. And I worked in radio. I had a music background. I was the last kid my dad thought would ever be a cop because I was always I was the proverbial cops kid where I was always in trouble. When I told him I was going to be in radio, he said that was perfect. He thought that was a perfect career for me because I had the perfect face for radio. And thanks, Dad. That's great. And then 10 years later, when I decided to go back to school for law enforcement, he's like, you're the last Rose kid I ever thought would be a cop because you were always brought home in the backseat. Well, I guess that's fair. But so I've been with Dodge County. I worked in Dodge County my entire career. Started in 2000, started on the road. Actually, I started on the posse as a volunteer in 96. Then got my part-time license, worked for a local police department in Dodge County, and then went to dispatch, worked in dispatch, and then in 2002 started on the road full-time. And then I've just worked my way up. I was elected sheriff in 2014.
2014, so you're going on 12 years or 11 or 12 years. Okay. Yeah. Well, thanks for your service and thank your family for their service.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it seems like you're combining your two careers, your radio career and your law enforcement career to come up with this podcast.
Yeah.
How did that idea come up in your head to honor
after we had a fallen officer in 2013, we've had 4 fallen officers in Dodge County over the years. And the most recent one is 2013. And one of my best friends, Lauren Gunther, he was a captain with Dodge County. And LEMA, the Law Enforcement Memorial Association here in Minnesota, helped with his celebration of life and celebration of service. And they did such an amazing job at helping us just grieve and focus on Loring and on figuring out how to move forward. And I love the organization, and I ended up running for the board. I've been on the board there for several years now with LEMA. And during COVID, I've had a studio in my home for 20 years, and I've done voiceover work forever. But during COVID, things were slow, and with my side work, and I was looking for something else to do. Or another project to take on. And working with LEMA, I've always, having worked with survivor families, you recognize that there's so much more to these stories than just the 3 or 4 sentence paragraph you get on the memorial web pages. And I thought, maybe this is a way for me to share the rest of the story of these fallen heroes. And I ended up putting a format idea together, ran it by my kids, because they were way more. I've never done a podcast before. I'd never listened to a podcast before this one, and my kids thought that was funny. They said that proves that I'm old. But the podcast is the same format. The first story that I did was Matthew Hamilton. He's the first line of duty death in Minnesota from the late 1800s, and it's kind of gone from there. It's been just an incredible experience for me.
It's a really well done. All of these pieces are, and if I counted right, you're up to 47 stories that you've told about.
47 stories with 50 different officers. Or I'm sorry, 49 different officers. I'm working on number 50 right now. Okay.
So tell us about how you put these together. We've spoken in the past, so I'm aware, but tell our viewers what goes into putting one of these stories together.
So for your listeners and viewers, just so you know, it's not an interview podcast. It's a storytelling podcast. So what I do is I in the beginning I try and introduce the listener to the era, to kind of set the mood as far as the era and what year we lost this officer. I introduce them to the community, to the agency, to the families, with the help of the officers who were there and the families who were left behind. They helped me tell the story of these officers. So you get to know them. So you feel like you know this officer. And then we walk you through step by step where we lost the officer. And at that point, you feel like you can visualize the area, you can visualize the agency, you feel like you know the officer, and it gives you that experience of that loss, and it puts you through the emotions that these families and these agencies go through.
I logged on to one yesterday, and I'm sorry I forget the officer's name, but the young officer in Lake City who died in about
Sean
2013.
Schneider. Yep, Sean Schneider. Yep,
Schneider. Okay. I felt my blood pressure going up because you involve or you add the 911 calls and the police dispatch calls in there, and it's a really emotional thing to listen to these stories, and you do such a nice you have a nice way of blending, like you said, the times that are going on with the event, and so you get brought back to that time of the event. Good job with that.
I appreciate that. For me, these stories are so personal because these are the family stories. They're the agency stories. They're the fallen officer story. And my goal with these is to make it as historically accurate as possible. So when I put these stories together, I do a full public data request from the agencies involved. I read all the reports. I have all the reports. I have the court documents. I've got all the evidence, photos, interviews, any radio or telephone transcripts that I can find, and then I match that with the recollection of the officers who were there, the recollection of the family. So my biggest fear with these when I do them, first of all, my biggest fear is I don't want to re-victimize these families. They've already been through enough. So I don't typically do stories any more current than 10 years. And that's kind of 10 years is kind of my limit, where any more current than 10 years, it's still too fresh for these families and these officers.
Sure.
But once I do the public data request, I put everything together. When I interview the families and the officers, I've already got a full timeline of that event already written up. And with most of the officers, I have their reports in front of me, just to make sure that the memories are accurate with the reports. And my biggest fear is obviously I don't want to re-victimize the family. So I make sure in the beginning that the families are ready to do it before I take on a story. But then beyond that, the most stressful part of these stories, aside from talking with these folks, is when the story goes online and I'm waiting to hear the feedback from the families. I am so stressed because I'm always worried that I'm going to miss the mark at honoring their fallen hero. It's never happened, but I'm always stressed about it. I'm always worried that it's just not going to, that somebody's going to be disappointed.
Well, as a consumer, I can give you my opinion. You do a fabulous job of honoring their lives and the whole profession of law enforcement. So thanks for what you've done there.
Oh, I appreciate it.
Out of those 47 stories, which story stands out to you as the most impactful to you?
There's so many of them that are impactful for different ways. The Corey Slifko story was really a tough one for me to get through, and it was an impactful one from the standpoint of the issue of mental health with law enforcement. That's a suicide story where Corey was a South St. Paul sergeant who committed suicide in 2019. And that story was used by his wonderful wife, Katie, to help push for legislation in Minnesota and federally for benefits for officers' families who have died by suicide. So to me, that was a super impactful story. If you listen to the Lauren Gunther story, that story really talks about my motivation for the podcast, which was my experience with Lima and wanting to honor these fallen heroes, and it explains how I ended up being sheriff, and where I'm at with my career, and having lost a dear friend like Loring. Other ones, there's so many different. The Sean Schneider one, for me, that was impactful because I listened to that one on the radio. I had friends that were there. I worked investigations back then, and hearing my friends go through that and be in that. Some of them are still struggling today with that event, because Sean was so loved by so many. Super impactful one. Robert Lawson, he was the Itasca County Sheriff, or a deputy that was killed back in 1981, and they called his nickname was Beefy. And that story is incredible because it was an 18-hour standoff, and he saved the lives of this young lady and her kids, and he literally was executed by Audie Fox, who was the guy that killed him. And that was an interesting story for me because I had officers who were there who helped me tell the story who are now in their 70s and 80s. So it was super interesting to talk with them and share that story. So many different stories, impactful in so many different ways for me, and I've made so many great friends and people that I've met along the way, and it's just been super rewarding for me.
How much time would you say you put into each story on average?
I would say it'll run, especially with the more in-depth stories. Of course, the older stories they're a little quicker just because there's not a lot of information there.
Right.
But with with the more recent stories, you're looking at anywhere from 60 to 80 hours.
Wow.
From start to finish. And, that's doing the research in the beginning. That's doing the public data requests, working with the agencies, talking with the families, figuring out who they're comfortable with me interviewing, doing the interviews with the families and the officers, figuring out the timeline, and putting everything together. It's a lot of work. I tried to in the beginning. I was pretty ambitious, and I thought I was going to do one every 2 weeks, not realizing how much time I was going to end up putting into them.
Yeah, it'd be hard to do your regular job.
Yeah, I have a full-time job. So I do one a month now.
Okay.
And that works a lot better for me, and it gives me more time with the families and more time to make sure I've got the data and the information right. But it's another, 80 hours. It takes a lot of time. I have my wife, who we've been together since the late 80s. God bless her. She's very patient with me, and she's a huge supporter of this project. So, she puts up with me being up here a lot.
What case are you currently working on? Are you able to share anything with us?
No, absolutely. So Sergeant Joe Bergeron was a Maplewood sergeant, and he was killed back on, it's going to be 15 years ago, May 1st in 2010. And that's a pretty wild story too. That one's coming up. I've got there's a ton of law enforcement within the Bergeron family. It's really cool, including one of his daughters. So we'll be talking to the family, be talking to the officer that I actually ended up getting into a fight with and shot and killed, the kid that killed Joe. He's on that officer's on the podcast.
St. Paul officer, right?
Yep, St. Paul officer. Yep. It's really going to be a good story. It's a terrible story, but it's a way to really honor Joe and his service and his sacrifice. And the other thing the podcast does is the podcast this kind of the secondary goal of the podcast is to show listeners or to remind listeners how the men and women who serve, how the men and women who go out the door every day and night and say goodbye to their families, not knowing whether they're going to come back or not. The podcast is another reminder of how important their calling is, and how amazing these men and women are who are willing to take on this calling, and the importance of us supporting them. And keep in mind, the podcast came out or started in late 2019, early 2020, when everything was going on post Floyd, and there was a lot of anti-law enforcement rhetoric. And to me, I had some people who said, this is probably the worst time for you to do a pro-law enforcement podcast. And I said, no, this is really the best time.
Maybe the best. Yeah.
It's the best time, because this is where people need to be reminded how important these men and women are who serve. And we tend to forget the families. We forget that this commitment that these men and women make to our communities doesn't stop with them. This commitment is made by their spouse, by their parents, by their kids. It's a lifelong commitment for this family, and that's so easy to forget. So the podcast is just a reminder, to honor the men and women currently serving, and not to ever forget the survivor families.
So this effort can't be cheap. I see that Law Enforcement Labor Services, LELS, sponsors at least partially some of your episodes.
They do.
But is there a way that the public can help support your effort of keeping these stories alive?
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple things. One, if you know of a family of a fallen officer who has a story that you feel is important that needs to be told, they all need to be told. But if you think, if there's a family that you think is ready to share these stories, something that's older than 10 years, there's a section on the website you can go to where you can submit your hero story. It's on the toolbar at the top. You can click that and let me know about the officer. Let me know about the family. I'd love to hear about it. I'd love to look into it. So support it that way. The other way to support it is just to download and listen. Listen to these stories and honor these families. They've gone through so much. Their sacrifice doesn't end. One of the spouses told me, she said, when this happened, when my husband was killed, there was so much attention given to it, and there was so much attention given to me and my family. She said, there was an officer out front. There were people calling me and emailing me and texting me, checking on me every day. Everybody's bringing food over. Lima's helping with the memorial planning. We put this huge celebration together for his service and his sacrifice. The media was talking about how amazing he was, which he was. And then she said after the funeral, 2 or 3 weeks after that, the phone calls started to slow down, the emails started to slow down, the messages, and it got to the point where that silence to her was deafening, because all she wanted was for people to keep talking about her husband. She was her biggest fear. And these survivor families, their biggest fear is that their fallen hero is going to be forgotten, that what they did is going to be forgotten, that their sacrifice is going to be forgotten. And so to support these families is so important. There's also a section on the podcast as well where you can click on it and support our mission, where you can submit a donation. There's a lot that goes into the podcast, from the hosting to the equipment to the software to the we use ancestry.com. There's so many different facets in the background to putting this together. That for me it's fun, because it takes two careers that I've had that I've loved, and it kind of molds them. Sure. I was a production director when I was in radio, so my big thing in radio, I was in the studio. I wrote the ads. I did special effects. I did that was my thing. So the podcast was a great segue from me going from Lima and law enforcement back into telling stories, which is something that I love to do. So it's been great. It's been super rewarding.
Yeah. Well, as a retired officer myself and the father of a current law enforcement officer in Minnesota, I thank you for what you're doing and keeping these stories alive.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
I hope this podcast will generate some interest in your podcast, the Officer Down Memorial Podcast. And we've been joined today by Sheriff Scott Rose, the producer of that podcast, and we thank you for your efforts and wish you well today. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for your support too, and your service.
He's walking eastbound. Officer down. I repeat, officer down.
Thank you for listening to this special edition of the Officer Down Memorial Podcast.